I'm Paul Sullivan, your host on the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, sublime, strange, and silly aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the primary parents, often feel they have to hide or at least not talk about their roles. One thing I know from personal experience is being a lead dad is not a traditional role for men, whether you work full-time, part-time, devote all your time to your family. Parenting is so often left up to mothers or paid caregivers. But here at the Company of Dads, our goal is to shake all that off and create a community for fathers who are lead dads and to welcome other dads who want to learn from those among us. Today, my guest is Bruce Feiler, best-selling author, sought-after speaker, and contemporary thinker. Bruce has written a dozen books, including his story of being a clown, like a real one, in a circus, and others about figures less prone to pratfalls, like Moses, Abraham, and God. The two that I want to talk about are the Council of Dads and the Secrets of Happy Families. He conceived the Council of Dads when he was diagnosed with a tumor in his leg and wanted to recruit some other dads to be there for his daughters if he wasn't. Fortunately, he's still here. And then there's a Secret Life of Happy Families, which fortunately is actionable stuff and not out of reach for most of us, though it takes a bit of work. Bruce lives in Brooklyn with his wife and their twin daughters, and we've got a lot to talk about today. Bruce, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
My pleasure. It's thank you for having me, and congratulations for all of us who care about dads. I'm just cheering you on as you try to figure out a way to bring us together and help us figure out these changing roles that we all find ourselves in.
That was such a sweet thing for you to say. And my first question is going to come across, I don't want to come across as snarky, but I'm fascinated by this. Reading your bio, your face is on a postage stamp in the Grenadines?
My face is on a postage stamp in the Grenadines.
Okay, so then let me ask you this. So I've confirmed that fact. Ex-New York Times columnist got to confirm the fact. So should my next question be why or how?
No, your next question should be, tell me a story of journalistic humiliation involving that postage stamp, right? Because
I never would have guessed that, but all right, go
because
ahead.
So please come on.
You answer that question. That's a much better
question.
Go ahead.
It's much more related to you because you, I'm guessing, in the course of your distinguished journalism career, occasionally went to an editor and pitched a story that editor rejected. Or maybe this didn't happen to you because you were so good, or maybe they didn't even make you pitch your stories. Well, I, a mere freelance journalist, when I found out that my face was on a postage stamp on the Grenadines, and that story in and of itself is an interesting story, because how that happened was that there was a clown superfan in the Grenadines who collected this stamp, and it was actually 4 stamps of professional clowns. And as you mentioned, I was a professional clown, right? So I learned to juggle when I was a kid. I ran a children's theater when I was in college, and I, in fact, thought about running off to join a circus and to join Clown College.
Oh yeah, I love this.
Which is the greatest marketing shtick of all time, actually. Okay, the former business writer, you must appreciate this, is that basically for the 250 years that there have been circuses, okay, which go back to the late 18th century, clowns were essentially older performers who couldn't perform anymore, or acrobats who got injured, or tag-along members of the family of some performing family. Okay, you never needed any official training, or gay men who wanted to be closeted. Okay, and if you think back to the greatest show on earth,
this is all part of like the over-credentialing of America. I love this. Like,
that is
need a
so
clown
good.
Credential.
That is so good. I'm going to steal that from you next time I tell that story, and I haven't told the story in probably 15 years. But anyway, so what happened was, in the 70s, these needs all collapsed. Right, gay men no longer needed a closeted space to hide as much. Older performers would get off the road and go work at Walmart. I mean, lots of things.
Or like the Rolling Stones, they would just keep going. They just wouldn't be as acrobatic or limber anymore.
There we go. Though, so basically, Ringling Brothers at that point, who had 3 circuses at that point, red, the blue, and the gold, needed a supply, and so they started a 6-week training program.
Oh my goodness!
Which in a feat of brilliance they called clown college, thereby persuading everybody that you needed to go to college, not in fact spend a long weekend where they taught you how to put makeup on and put goofy shoes on you and said, go out and fall on your butt and laugh about it. Okay. So, and then what they would do is when the circuses would travel to every city in America, they would hold quote unquote auditions and invite the local press. So every local weatherman would go out and audition for clown college, and they would get free publicity for this program. It was absolutely brilliant. So I did not go to clown college. In fact, I went to customary college, and then I went to graduate school. I went to the Ivy League, and I went to graduate school at Cambridge, and then had lived abroad for a long time and said, I want to join the circus. So I spent a year in reacclimatizing myself to America as a clown in the Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers Circus, 99 cities, 501 circuses, every day from March to December, without a day off. And on the back of the book that I wrote about that experience, called Under the Big Top, is a picture of me in clown makeup. And there was some super fan in Grenadines who turned that into a postage stamp. And then somebody saw it and wrote me through my website. And at the time,
oh man, I wanted you to say that they sent you a postcard with that stamp on it, and you were like,
no,
what?
They did not do that. They sent me, they notified me. You can actually now Google it, Bruce Feiler clown postage stamp. It'll show up. And at the time, this now brings us to the journalism, and half of the time we've now wasted on this story.
Yeah.
I was under contract at Gourmet Magazine, where I would travel around the world and write food adventure stories, including going to the circus arts kind of Oscars in Monaco. And I went to Ruth Reichel, late of the New York Times, and
former food critic for the New York Times, well known, always in disguise, not clown disguise, but always in different disguises when she go to dinner. Yeah.
And I said to her, and I had to pitch stories to her because I had 3 stories a year that I would do for her, or 5 or whatever the number was. And I was like, Ruth, I want to go to the Grenadines and walk down the street and see if anybody slaps the back of my head. And she slapped me down. She did not give me.
Goodness.
She did not give me the gig. And then later she recommended that I replace her replacement as the restaurant critic in the New York Times, which by that point the disguise was out. I'm like, my face is on a postage stamp.
It's on a postage stamp.
How can I be a restaurant critic? Everybody will know what I look like.
Oh my goodness. All right. I want to get to the Council of Dads and these other books. But first of all, I mean, you're best known for writing and thinking about modern life. But, how did you go from the Old Testament to contemporary Brooklyn? Was it when you got sick, or how did you make that transition in your writing career?
It was a combination of things. So my story, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
I left there. I went to college. I learned about myself as a Southerner by moving to the North. This was the 80s. It was the age of discount airfare. I was like, time to learn about myself as America. So I went to Japan. And I started writing letters home of the, you're not going to believe what happened to me variety. And when I got back to Georgia, everyone said, I loved your letters. And I was like, great. Have we met? And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around, sweet. And they went sort of viral in a 1980s sense of the word. And I thought, well, I should write about this. And so I sold my first book at 24. I've never held a job since. And that was those years of traveling. That was the circus, that was Japan, that was England. Then there was this decade, as you alluded to, of writing and making television about the Bible. And I also got married and had children. So it was a confluence of 2 things. Number one, here I was in a different lifestyle, balancing, because I also married a traveler. My wife, Linda, started and runs an organization called Endeavor that supports high impact entrepreneurs in 40 countries now around the world. Mm-hmm. So we had this, we always wanted a parent on the children, and we were this is what you do all day, every day. We were balancing how to have a parent, but also be an individual, have a parent on the children and be an individual. And then the cancer came up, and it was in 2008. The girls were 3. It was a kind of a fluke thing. A blood test produced an elevated ALK-Phos number, which is a number no one ever even looks at. Yeah. And I had a doctor who said, this is weird. And she gave me one test after another. And then I got a call from a doctor walking in on the Upper East Side between appointments. And she said, the tumor in your leg is not consistent with a benign tumor. Now, you're a writer, I'm a writer. That is a double negative. Like,
Yeah, right.
editor, and it took me a second to convert that double negative into a worse negative, right? Which is I have.
So that's
cancer.
not good. Is that what that
Yeah,
means?
exactly right. This is a not good. No, I don't know if that's actually right, frankly, but that produced a whole series of events. We can talk about whatever dimension of those you want.
Yeah.
But it meant that for 2 years, for a year I was in bed. For 2 years I was on crutches, and for a year after that I was on a cane, and I couldn't travel. And so I had this kind of intense, travel, adventure, curiosity, sort of Indiana Jones meets your local rabbi or preacher or priest or whatever it is. And so I said, well, I can't apply it to the rest of the world. Here's an idea. I'll apply it to my home. Nobody particularly welcomed that, but that's what happened. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna like do archaeology
your
on what's happening at the breakfast table.
Right, your daughters were young enough, so they thought it was probably a charming idea, and they couldn't really protest. As opposed to now, you said they're 17. There's no way this thing flies now.
It does not apply now. Although in the best moments, actually, they or the worst moments, they turned that archaeology to me.
Remember when? So I have to ask you. So I'm actually so we've been joking, but I'm serious. I'm actually part of a council of dads for a family where the father died of cancer when the girls were then 4 and 7, and they're now that was 12 years ago. And the girls are doing great. They're wonderful girls. But I was the writer dad. So whenever they had questions, they'd come to me, and I'd do my best. But to be honest, I'm not sure I was super successful. I would always help whenever they would ask, but I would, I had kids, but tell me about the council and how you came up with the idea, and what you were, such a novel idea back then, but what you were hoping to, achieve.
So I love that story, and I salute your service, and I acknowledge and empathize with the vulnerability and the confusion, and like what is the role, and what should I be doing? Have I done a good job? Have I not done a good job? And I think that that's real. And let's get into both of those. Just to kind of dispense with the narrative, I was diagnosed with on a Tuesday. I had an osteogenic sarcoma in my left femur. I broke that femur when I was 5 in a biking accident, and 38 years later, it cancerified. And there's 800 people a year who get an osteosarcoma. 85% are under 21. So there's only 100 people a year who get this disease. I was one of the 100 that year. 20 years ago, they would have cut off my leg and hoped, and there was a 15% survival rate. But they did determine that one cocktail was effective on young people, and they give that to older people. But it's designed for younger people who can bounce back and be more resilient than a 43-year-old man could. So it was brutal. And I was in and out of the hospital. I had a 17-hour surgery in which my femur was removed, replaced with titanium. They took my fibula from my calf and relocated it to my thigh, where it now lives. So all this is descending on me. I get diagnosed on a Tuesday. You don't sleep when you get a diagnosis like this. Your life is turned upside down. And I thought in very rapid order, well, I've lived a full life, okay? No one's ever going to say I didn't live the hell out of my life.
But how old are you at this point? How old are you?
I was 43. Okay. And I had best-selling books and hosted TV shows, and, I had some sort of a name and footprint in the culture, and people would have said, that's sad, but they would have moved on. And I thought my wife actually would be sad, and it would be difficult, but she's a dynamic, active woman, and she would find love and life in her life. And I immediately went to the kids. Like the longest term impact was going to be on them. And I think it is because I was a writer. It was sort of like the art projects I wasn't going to mess up, and the aisles I wasn't going to walk down, and the walks I wasn't going to take with them. But it was my voice. Like it was like, they're not going to have my voice. What would Dad have thought? What would he have done here, right? And people would say to me, "Oh, they're very young. They're not going to remember." And I would say, that's the worst thing that I can hear.
Even worse. Yeah.
I don't want them to not remember. I want them to remember. So 3 days later, I sort of awoke. I put that in air quotes because, as I just said, you don't sleep. And I had this idea, like I was going to reach out to men, and I was going to create this group. And it came, I have to say, it came to me fully formed. Like it was, and I was going to call it the Council of Dads. And I knew right away that was the term. I have now written, I don't even know, I just turned in, I think it was my 16th book. And I don't know your experience, because I know you've written a couple of books that titles come on day one or day the last. They never come in the,
They come in the shower or on a walk. Yeah.
They never come in the middle. And this one, trust me, I just had one that came at the last and it was very stressful. This one came to me in the middle. Like I knew right away that that's what I wanted to call it, but I didn't know what it was. And I actually also decided that I was not going to tell my wife, right? Because she's very upbeat. She's, as a friend of mine said, her point of view ranges from thumbs up to thumbs sideways. She's just not a negative person. Right. I kind of like wallowing in pain and despair and vulnerability and shame and fear. I love these things.
It's like a little Southern Gothic in you, like the Savannah boyhood.
I don't know. And also for men, I think that there's no permission giving for men to talk about their feelings. Like I can talk about this for hours. And I wasn't going to tell her, but I couldn't control myself. And so a couple of days later, we're driving. We had dropped the kids off with their grandparents, and we were actually going to meet the surgeon who ultimately rebuilt my leg. And I was like, I have this idea. I want to tell you. It's to ask a group of men. And she loved the idea, but she instantly rejected all of my nominees.
Oh, no.
Right? So she was like, well, I like Paul, but I would never ask him for advice.
Not that guy.
Yeah, and if I made Paul the writer guy, like he would just never show up. Like, so I would never, you know.
Don't say that. Don't say that.
Okay. So you see, I told you I like going for.
My goodness.
I like the real thing.
But who the guys who made the cut? You had like your buddy from kindergarten. You had like college roommate. Those are obvious. You had a camp counselor, but you had a couple other guys in there. I mean, how did they actually make the cut? Is this like the NFL Combine to try to get through here? Like how do they get on the?
Well, what was not like the NFL Combine was if we're gonna go to sports, we're gonna go to sports. If we're not gonna, like, this is such a freaking dad cliche. Oh, let's make it about sports. Okay, fine.
I just want to know how they made the cut. How these guys made the cut of all the guys. Unless you don't have a lot of friends, and this is all you had left after your wife like vetoed everybody else.
They were like, a lot of them were Yale Jewish lawyers. Like this was the first problem. Like there was a very kind of narrow. There was a narrow thing. So the answer is, what is not like the Combine is that there were 7 quarterbacks competing, although maybe there were 7 Yale Jewish lawyers. But what was like the Combine was that I wanted people from different parts of my life, right? That could be different parts of my voice, because my friend from kindergarten, who, is not as close a friend now, can't address what I'm like in this situation, or this buddy of mine that I traveled with for a lot in my early 20s. So, and then I did, interestingly enough, what you said, which was I gave him a role. And I think that this was an instinct. And to me, this gets to the question that you mentioned. Like, I somehow, we made a couple of rules. Okay, let me take a step back. We made a couple of rules. Only men. Okay, probably half of my closest friends are women, but no, only men. We were going to do the dad voice, not family. They were already going to be there. So I didn't, in the various iterations of Hollywood who tried to make this into movies and television, people wanted family and whatever. I said no family. They'll already be there. And then I said I wanted each dad to have a different value, like travels dad, values dad, business entrepreneur dad, etc. I also felt, and never said out loud, but if I were doing it again, I would do it this way, is you could swap people out. Right. So in other words, if it turns out that my kids were interested in,
but you had like the Security Council at the UN, and then you had like rotating members. So like, one guy was China, whether or not he wasn't going anywhere, but the other.
So what I think that what I didn't fully realize that I think about now is, number one, people are busy. Right. So it's different. I actually wrote the piece that led to the column that became this life column that I wrote for a decade in the Times, in the Sunday Style section, was a piece about reimagining godparents. Right. So, and I think giving people a specific role, you are writer dad, right? So that when they have to write something, whether it's a vows or a college application or a paper, they'll call you. I like that because it's confined. Because you're a dad of your own now. You
can accomplish that. Like as writer dad, when I was asked, I could help on those things.
Correct.
And I was like,
And I like that. And what I mean by switching people out is let's just say that one of my kids turned out. I'll give a real example. One of my kids turns out to really be interested in museums and art history and art conservation. there ain't nobody on the Council of Dads that knows anything about that, right? So I would say now, go get a male in my life who knew me but could help them, like could
Yeah.
meet them where they are. If they're interested in baseball or rock music or art conservation, go get somebody and make it a doable thing. And then I guess the other thing that I would say is that what I learned, and maybe the greatest value of this thing, is that the people themselves play a different role. Okay, so you're now in the dad business, right? And as a result, you were forced to have this kind of putrid conversation about work-life balance, right?
Oh no, I actually, to be honest, I don't even use that phrase. I
I know,
call it
'cause it's
life. I
awful.
hate it. It's just life,
Yeah.
and then you divide your life up. Like sometimes you play golf, sometimes you
Correct. It's a
walk
complete
the desert.
complete
Yeah,
awful framework. But I do think there is, in the case of kind of people in our lives, there is, this gets at it, which is that we have our family,
yeah,
that's opportunity and that's fraud, right? We have our work, both the men and the women, the moms and the
yeah.
dads. What has gotten pushed aside in contemporary life is friendship, because that is what we don't have time for. And I actually think that we're in a crisis of friendship that we don't talk about anywhere near enough. And that what this idea of a Council of Dads did was it created a new role in our lives, right? Which is people that are not family. They're this new kind of category. They're not friends and they're not family. They're
Yeah.
this new kind of heightened category. And that's great. And everybody feels it, and we feel it. One of the men in the Council of Dads actually had some illness later in his life, and his child was having a milestone life event, which I will keep off stage to keep this story somewhat anonymous for that dad. And I got a call from this man's spouse saying, he's not going to be there for this. You don't have to show up. You're not going to see him. And I went to my wife and I was like, what do I do? Do I travel across the country to go to this event? And she was like, this is a Council of Dads moment. You must go now.
You must
because
go, yeah.
you have to step up. And so that kind of code has been invaluable.
So I'll say the way you talked about it's sort of that lack of friendship in these bonds, and some of my, if I have 4 or 5 friends, good friends, 3 are from high school, 1 is from college, and the other is my golf partner, and I had lots of acquaintances. But rewind to 2020, I write about this in my final column in the New York Times.
I remember.
I'd been a lead dad for years, and it's been something I kept quiet. I walked around our town. I was New York Times dad. I was book writing dad. I was a keynote speaking dad. But what I really was the primary parent. And it was during COVID when we're all trapped inside. My wife is worried about what's going to happen to her business, and I'm busier than I've ever been. And I said, this is kind of lonely. Like, I don't have my normal, I'm not going in on a train, going into New York Times. I'm not having a fancy lunch or a glass of wine with somebody after work. I'm not, I'm here, nothing. And I was like, every other type of parent has a community. A go to work dad has his tons of community. Stay at home moms, particularly in suburban America, lots of community. Every town, city, neighborhood in America reaches out to working moms. But what is there for, fathers who are the primary parents? And that was, as you were saying, like with Council Dad, that was really the genesis for the company of dads, because I thought we need something, to bring these. We're still guys, we still do guy things, we still have fun, but we're different. We're fundamentally different than the go to work dad, and we're not always welcome among groups of moms.
So I think that what's interesting about this, and I don't want to say that I think that this is happening, but I believe that it might happen. And my prognostication is that it has a good chance of happening, which is I think that we might very well, to your point, look back at the pandemic as a little bit of an inflection point. And I think in this conversation in the following way, because, well, first of all, in general, the pandemic was a pause, right? So it was a collective, in the language of the work I do now, collecting life stories and talking about life transitions, and this is what I've been doing for the last 5 years, as you know, and my book Life is in the Transitions came out in the middle of the pandemic. It was a pause, and pauses give us an opportunity, not just to revisit ourselves, but to revisit habits and patterns and kind of establish things. And so there wasn't a way that everybody stopped and relooked at things. But the second thing that happened is that's related to this is that everybody was at home. And I think that these issues, which have been still largely gendered
Hmm.
along household management, who runs the
Yeah.
family, right? All these kinds of things. Everybody realized that you could no longer gender it because everybody was
You
home.
also couldn't lie about it. You couldn't say, "Oh, look at how busy I am. How could I possibly help with that?" Like you're working from home. I'm working from home. I see exactly what you're doing and not doing.
Right, exactly. So, and we know that people, if you ask, moms and dads how much of the work you
Yeah.
do, we know that they both say 80%.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that as we now go back into this hybrid world, right? This is the world that you wrote about and thought about for years, right? Is anybody ever going to show up in a white collar office on a Friday again? The Washington Post had a piece last week that said no, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's going to stay home on Fridays, right? So and therefore a lot of these standards are being rewritten collectively.
Mhm.
Okay, my way of talking about this, Paul, is that the divide that separates work from family is more porous than it's ever been. And it's for two reasons. One is that more women are in the workplace, and that I feel like is we talk about a lot. Right, 3/4 of women now work outside the home. But what we don't talk about enough is that the dads are much more involved in the parenting space. Okay. And the idea of leaving early to go coach Little League, then having dinner, right? I'm fond of saying back to my the happy family part of my life, the
Yeah.
two most difficult times in every family are the hour after everybody wakes up and the hour before everyone goes to bed. Like those
Mhm.
are the two nuclear winters, to date myself. um, and if we could solve the problems in those 2 hours, we would make every family twice as happy in 3 weeks,
Oh
which is
yeah.
one of
Which
the
one would
reasons.
you pick if you had to get rid of one? Your kids are older now, but if you had to get rid of one, the hour in the morning or the hour at night, which one would you get rid of?
You mean if I could solve for one, which would I
Yeah, just
solve? The
solve. Yeah,
hour
just
the hour in the morning, absolutely. I don't
really.
think
I
that.
do the
Uh,
opposite.
uh,
The hour in
uh,
the I'm up earlier than my kids. I'm ready to go. I get it all done, but it's at night when I'm tired. We've had dinner. We're trying to do the dishes, and then it's like just there was a book. There's a great kids book 10 years ago. Go the fuck to sleep. That's all I
yes.
can think of. That always plays in my head. Like just it's a lullaby. Go the fuck to sleep.
The reason I would say I would focus more on the first hour of the morning is because I think that this hour, first of all, everybody's at it at that time. Yeah, everybody is at their maximum stress, but also because it can introduce uh, ways of addressing problems that can spread out, right? So I talk about uh, agile gatherings, right? They're very
Yeah.
short. I talk about making checklists for people to do. I talk about having parents pull back from trying to kind of control everything
I love
themselves
the
and get
checklist. Like it's
yeah,
right here. Just
yeah,
check it off. Like
but do it yourself as opposed to mom and
yes.
dad screaming, mom or dad or mom and dad screaming at the children and or at each other. So to me, it's a kind of a perfect petri dish for, in effect, trying to cede more control of the family away from the parents toward the children. Because when your kids are young, you can get them to do things maybe right as they get older every now and then, but parenting is unlike anything I've ever discovered in one key aspect, which is that our children are born entirely dependent on us, and our job is to put ourselves out of business,
Yeah.
right? Our job is to make our children independent from us.
Yeah.
And the only way that's going to work is if slowly, gradually, in an age appropriate way, you cede more of the gears to them. And the morning is the perfect time to kind of test
Okay.
and make that happen.
So I want to touch on the transitions book at the very end. I had that on my list, but I want to come back, to happy families. You obviously wrote the book way before the pandemic. There's lots of good stuff in there. Particularly, there's this whole notion of the oscillating family narrative, which
Yes.
is like we weren't just a straight line to success, or it started up here and everything went to shit. It's really the ups and downs of life that makes kids more resilient. But how did the pandemic and this fundamental, unplanned, unwanted, pause or shift in the lives we've been leading, how do you think that has impacted or will impact happy families? How is it how they incorporate it into their narrative, or how do you see it, playing out over the next, generation?
So when I set out to work on that book, the sort of the core idea of it was that everybody's stuck. Okay, we're a century we're a century into modern psychology, and we've heard all the things from the psychologists. We're all still confused, right? And so what do? Right? We like call our parents, but their experience is so dated as to be irrelevant, right? Or we Facebook our friends and they're just as clueless as we are, and everybody's stuck. So what if we go out? But there's a lot of knowledge out there about how to manage time, right? And how to make teams run more effectively, how to have difficult conversations. And like, what if I went and talked to largely dads in other organizations? Like, what wisdom do you have that can make my family run more effectively? And I said at the beginning I made one promise to my wife. She was like, okay, I got it. You were a circus clown. Like, you walk the Bible. Like, I get it. You're going to go do these things, but don't bring me like theory. Bring me things that actual families are doing, and I'm willing to try. I made that promise to her, and I kept that promise to her. I made two promises to myself, and I broke both of them. One was I wasn't going to talk to any therapists because they've had their say. I talked to a sex therapist and how to talk to kids about sex. And everybody seems happy that I did that. So I broke that one. The other one I broke to myself, and this was, you have to remember, the early years of the internet, right? When everything was like a listicle. Remember that term, right? So I was like, I'm not going to turn this into a list of the 3 or 7 or 10 things you need to do to have a happy family, because I hate those lists, right? I mean, as a writer, I have to produce them from time to time, but I hate them because I usually disagree with number 7 and I forget number 3, and my kids will never get into college, right? So, but when I went out and started talking to people, lo and behold, it turns out that there are like certain things that they do in common. So I sort of made this non-list list of things that high-functioning families have in common. Number one,
tell the truth. The book publisher said, "Hey, Bruce, is really good, but what about a list?
What about a list? How are you going to get on TV? What is that on the Today Show? Where
all right, so number one.
They adapt all the time, right?
Yeah,
so
right,
I thought, oh, I'm a dad. I'll make 3 rules and I'll stick to these rules, right? And it doesn't work that way, right? Because we're all dynamic, we're all interacting. Okay, Paul's going to leave his stable job, right, to run a startup, and then there's a pandemic, and then what did you just say? Your wife's business is challenged, and by the way, this kid has lacrosse practice on the near side of town, and that kid now is tutoring math or being tutored in math on the far side of town. And it's a week later, it's going to be different. So you need to adapt. And like, we need systems that's why family meetings and checkboards and all these things that have sort of the ideas that have emerged from that book, oscillating family narratives, that's adapting. But you can't adapt all the time. You've got to have some core. So the second is high functioning families talk a lot. Okay. Family mission statements, right? Values, how to have difficult conversations. This is all part of the talking, and not just about problems, but about what it means to be part of a family. Like, what is it that we hold dear? Okay. And then third, they go out and play, right? Because you got to have some positive memories that balance out the challenging times which are going to come. So,
okay, so COVID
the
hits.
answer to the question is
you can't adapt in COVID. You're sick of talking to each other, and you're not allowed to go out and play. So how do we, how do these lessons apply to those, that 18-month period or more?
Okay, so how did we get through? Well, first of all, we came up with we had to rewrite all the rules.
Yeah, in
real time. Okay, wait a minute now. Okay, this is your workspace, and if I'm doing this, you can't walk through the back. We've had a tool.
You can. That BBC guy, remember, he went viral, and now like it happens all the time.
Right.
Like,
okay. So fine. So we rewrote those rules. You don't need a quiet space. Sorry. Okay. Or we need to move. Okay. Or we're going to move. Right. I mean, to jump ahead to life transitions, 60% of people move in a life transition. And we saw that, right? All the people who have moved in the pandemic. So in fact, that's adaptability. We're going to have to change all of our expectations and rewrite our rules in real time. How are we going to do this? Are we just going to do it? No, we have to talk about it. We need to say, what do you need? What do I need? What is it changing? How, so the only way, the only way to adapt is either for one person by fiat to insist. But in this case, all the marbles are moving at the same time, right? It's not like, the pandemic. Okay, can I pull this off? I'm not going to pull this off, but I'm going to try. Okay. The pandemic was not billiards, right? Where everyone is stable in a little triangle, and one person is changing. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm quitting my job and everything else is stable. So I'm the cue ball going in. I'm going to beat this to death into the little triangle. There's probably a better word for it, of billiard balls. It's marbles, right? In a bowl. Everybody is moving at the same time and clashing up against one another in different ways. And therefore, the only way to accommodate it is to talk about this change that you're doing. Okay. And then as for the play, what did people do? They started baking, right? They started gardening. They started board gaming. They started puzzles. They started all of these things that we now think of as pandemic activities, from right Peloton to masterclass to
I eat my sourdough bread on my Peloton, and I feel very
exactly.
2020.
Yes, that's the point, right? And you listen to Clubhouse at the time, right? So that's right. So these are what new ways both to play together, but also to escape and get time to yourself. It's all the things. So I actually feel like those three benchmarks were not rewritten because they're absolute. Yeah.
But now we come out of this, and a year ago the economy is roaring. Inflation's in check. I don't want to get too nerdy here, but unemployment rate is super low, so workers have the upper hand now. As we're talking now, things are starting to shift. Inflation is up. People are trying to figure out, how do I go back to work? So I feel like we had this moment coming out of the pandemic where workers were going to say, look, and this is something I'm super passionate about, there's no need to go back to 2019. We found that this can work. Unless you are an open heart surgeon, you can do most activities from home some of the time, not all the time. We need to meet human beings. We need to be together and brainstorm, but you can do a lot of those things. And now you have some of these companies that have invested billions and billions of dollars in physical real estate. And they're like, well, wait a second, I don't want to sit here by myself. I want some people to come in. And because of, who knows, it's going to be economy's fluid, but seemingly changing economic dynamics, they're trying to claw some of that back. So if you are, when you think about transition, so now we're going to the third book, when you think about transitions and, those families who came up with a way that was somewhat working during the pandemic to have a lead dad, to have a working mom, or vice versa, and be somewhat happy, talking more, adapting more, playing more. And now you're in this super uncertain time where, you said nobody will ever go to an office again on a Friday. And I just talked to this guy at a firm, and his office has specifically said that you will not go in on the only days you can stay home are Tuesday and Thursday, because if everybody stayed home on Friday, they just go, have time for themselves and be with their kids. So they're trying to cut that off. So it's too random to, but what do we do now? Like this is kind of a forced transition, or, gradual forced transition back into a world of work that, most of us haven't seen in 3+ years. So, I mean, who has the upper hand? How do we adapt? How do parents think through this moment with their life, not work-life balance, but as you and I have agreed, with their life?
So I'm going to throw a curveball into this conversation by saying that I'm actually not going to talk about the books that we've been talking about. I'm actually going to talk about the book that I just finished, which is really all about this, and it is about the future of work. And I'm going to make a kind of meta point that links all of these ideas together. Let me tee this up by saying what I've been doing the last 5 years, okay? And that is I've been collecting and analyzing life stories. I went through a series of disruptive life events, from getting cancer to having financial trouble to having my father, who had Parkinson's at the time, tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. And in fact, growing out of that work that I did in Happy Families about how to write your family narrative, and a piece that I wrote in the New York Times called "The Stories That Bind Us," that was the most viral thing I've ever written. I didn't know how to tell my life story anymore, and I didn't tell it for a long time. And when I did, what I realized is that everybody has a story of how their life was disrupted or interrupted or beaten up or set back in some way. And so I've spent the last 5 years crisscrossing the country, collecting now what has become 400 life stories in 5 years, of 1,500 pages, 1,500 hours of conversations, 10,000 pages of transcripts. And I've analyzed them both for this book called Life is in the Transitions that came out in the middle of the pandemic, and a new book called The Search, which will be out in the spring of 2023. And when I say that there's a big idea that links all of the things that we've been talking about, it is the following: that what any of these events are is a break in the normal, right? It's a rupture in this. We're telling a certain story, and then there's a break, and we need to tell a new story, okay? And the way I think about this, the term I use is this: that there is what I call a life quake, right? Which is an event that a massive burst of change in your life. Mm-hmm. What you're talking about here in work is what I call work quakes, things that kind of break the normal. And the way to think about these events, from my point of view, is that they are a meaning vacuum, is that they suck the normal way of processing and making sense of the world. They suck it out. Mm. So what a life transition is it's a meaning factory. It is the process of creating and generating a new meaning in your life, writing a new chapter in your life story, right? So that the life quake puts you on your heels, and the life transition is what puts you back on your toes. So to get to the specific question that you asked, yes, I believe that that the power has been moving toward the worker who says, I want more control over my life. I want more freedom. I want to work hybrid in some way. I'm tired of keeping my family. Also, I'm tired of keeping my personal life out of the office. Okay. I also do a lot of speaking, as you do. And I'm now getting more and more speeches, invitations for large corporations who now have mental health conversations. I wrote a piece on Harvard Business Review about this. You cannot, the old days when you can say, go deal with your personal problem on your own, and I'm going to send you a fruit basket. Okay. You can't do that anymore, because everybody's personal life is now in the office, and that membrane is more porous than it's ever been, as I was starting to say earlier. So yes, we may go through a downturn. Is it going to be as steep as the 08, 09 downturn? Maybe, probably not. Maybe it'll be shallower. We don't even yet know if it's going to have large-scale layoffs. People are starting to talk about a downturn that doesn't have large-scale layoffs, because companies learned in the last time that rehiring is too challenging. But the number of people who've quit their job, every month, and you know this, the quit rate has gone up every year except for one for 20 years. These are long-term trends that are happening in the workplace, and meaning is inseparable from work. We know all of the data, you know it 4 times better than I do, that every generation, we know in the family space, right? You look at the numbers, they're very, very clear. In the dad space in particular, that Xer dads more involved than boomer dads, millennial dads more involved than Xer dads, and the Zers, insofar as the older Zers out there are also saying we want equality, right? That's the generation of this rewriting the gender rules in real time. So people don't always meet those goals, but that is the goals. It's the same thing with meaning. Every generation has said, I want more meaning out of my life and more meaning out of my work than ever before. And this, a 6 or 18-month recession is not going to change this generational
the
shift.
Desire for that.
That's what I feel. I feel like that we are moving from a means-based economy to a meaning-based economy, and that is an inexorable change that has yet to reach everybody, but will reach more and more people, and that the worker fundamentally has the ability to write their own story. The days when you have to do what your parents wanted you to do, or do what you did, you majored in college, that is long gone. Okay. And I've written a whole new book that will help you, in fact, write your own work story.
I love it. That's where we're going to end. Bruce Feiler, thank you so much for being my guest on the Company of Dads podcast. I always like to end with, that was a great way to end, but a lighter question. Direct dad advice from you. I have to ask, was being a circus clown, did that give you any sort of leg up in parenting, particularly now that you got teenage daughters, finishing up high school? Being a clown, any leg up?
In the moment of highest tension, crack a joke.
There you go. That's all we need to know. Bruce, thank you again for being my guest. This has been wonderful.
Best of luck with the company. We're all cheering you on, Paul. Thank you.